and welcome to Incorruptible Mass. We are here to help us all transform state politics because we know that we could have a state and a legislature that truly represents the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. And today we will be talking about amendments. Why there are so many that all get pulled before they can get voted on. We'll talk a little bit about the legislative cycle just to remind you of what happens in Massachusetts every 2 years. We will talk about a little bit about a few specific amendments that have been announced and then pulled. And we'll talk about why this happens. So we look forward to the conversation. Before we do, let me have my illustrious co-hosts introduce themselves. I will start with Jonathan.
Hello, Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his. I'm an activist joining from Boston in the South End. I've been active on different progressive issue and electoral campaigns for over a decade now.
Thank you. And Jordan.
Wearing my James Baldwin shirt today. I can't believe what you say because I see what you do for the legislature. And so I am Jordan Berg Powers, he, him. I live in Worcester, Massachusetts. I have the misfortune of having 14 years experience working in and around the Massachusetts state legislature.
Oh, and I am Anna Callahan, coming at you from Medford, she, her, mostly spent a bunch of years doing like local politics, local political organizing, but also love working with these folks on helping people understand state politics. And today I'm pretty excited to talk about the process of amendments and how bizarre it is in Massachusetts. I would love for us to start off by talking about the difference between Massachusetts and our legislative cycle and other states, state legislatures and their legislative cycles, with just a quick intro of saying we sort of force this very structured series of abilities that the legislature is sort of allowed to do at different times. You know, there's a very short window of time to get in anything you want to be considered over the session. Then there's a window of time where they have hearings. There's a window of time where things go to committees. There's a window of time when, you know, X, Y, and Z happens. And these guys are going to talk about it more in depth and also about how strange it is because it really limits people's ability to pass legislation that may come up at the wrong, quote unquote, wrong time of a 2-year cycle. And it's not impossible to introduce it, of course, but it really, the system we have doesn't lend itself to just introducing and passing legislation at the appropriate time for that legislation, rather than at this structured, regimented time that the leadership sort of hands down. Who would love to jump in on this topic?
I'm happy to say a few things, and then Jordan, definitely tag in. So Massachusetts is one of 10 states that has a at least nominally full-time state legislature. Many states, if people follow other states often that are part-time legislatures, typically they're like in session for 3 months, they do a bunch of things, and then they're out. So there'll be like flurry of activity during that period, and that they would have to call a formal like special legislative session to do anything else. Massachusetts, however, with being it's like nominally full-time, but that exists with both a formal legislative session and periods of what are quote unquote called informal legislative session, which means that there's no actual like bills being passed. In that at least no bills passed in a quote informal session unless it's anodyne, nobody's objecting to it. It doesn't need the same degree of process. But as Anna, as you're noting before, it's a very structured process where they just simply don't pass bills in the first few months. January is reserved for filing bills. February is reserved for getting committee assignments. And those months are also kind of dedicated to passing rules. I'll also give a shout out to the fact that we will likely end the legislative session without joint rules being passed for the session. They've yet to actually decide upon agree so that we just live in the joint rules that were last passed, and they stay on autopilot until they change them, which they haven't done. And then you have to have hearings, and every bill needs a hearing. And so then it pushes everything back, because if they're always busy with something else in the legislative cycle, that, as well as even the way in which the budget happens at set months, that all of those self-imposed restraints on time lead them to bunch everything up at the very end of the session, which leads to what we're in the midst of when we're recording this now. It's the day before the last day of the formal legislative session, which ends on July 31st. And then suddenly things start like actually being passed in a flurry of last minute activity when they've been at this since last January, and they could have done many of these things at any given time. And most bills, shout out to any new and exciting bills filed for the first time. Many of them are not new. And so it's not as though they needed all of this time to be hard at work of working with them. They've done it in past sessions. It's the same people. Rarely do they ever get like one thing just quickly, and I'll kind of tag over about how rarely they ever leave. One line, I think one of the former heads of MassVote used to use the acronym RAID to describe the only ways that legislators ever seem to leave of retirement, appointment, indictment, or death.
Yes, the old indictment. Excellent.
Yeah, that's my favorite. That's my favorite one. You got me. I love that. I used to love when he would say that. It's my favorite. Yeah, he's the best. I just want to say, yeah, that just the same thing. That just like it's the thing they will tell you is, look, we have to like go through our processes, but they don't have processes. They're not, they're not working in the committee rooms. And what do I mean by working in the committee rooms? In most legislatures, information comes into the committee rooms, and then the committee will work to form a bill based on said testimony and things, and then that will get workshopped with staff, and then that staff and then the legislators and the staff will craft a bill, and then that bill they'll try to kick it around to their colleagues to like figure out like what to do. So a lot of times, especially in Republican legislatures, they'll have pre-made bills from activists, in their case corporations, or ALEC, and they'll go into the legislative process to get a sense of like, where are people in the legislature, in the committee, and then they'll work it in the committee, and then they'll pass it through the thing. We don't do any of those things. We don't do either of those things in our legislature. Our legislature staff is not working on the finite details of bills. Very rarely. Occasionally. Mostly they're doing constituent services. They're working on trying to understand maybe the bills. They're maybe getting answers from the government agency who might oversee the bill. So they are doing a little bit of work on it, but they're not sort of taking in testimony. The testimony process has no purpose in the Massachusetts legislature. It doesn't inform what they end up doing. It doesn't change how they look at it. It is just to rack up numbers and have press hits so that the press will cover it, right? Like that's its only purpose, is outward. It's not inward. It's not to affect the process inward into the building. And then, so they don't do that either. And then ultimately only the speaker decides. Yeah. And maybe a few people around him, Aaron Michaelowicz and the speaker. Those are it. That's the people who decide. They're not shipping it. Are there bills that get to the forefront because a bunch of reps ask for it and it starts to get shipped around? Occasionally, but almost never. Right? Like that's why I say it's akin to winning the lottery. So like the normal makings of a process where and they'll say, but what about this, Jordan? And they'll have one example of that, where it went through one of these normal processes. But that's the exception. The rule is that none of this other stuff is happening through regular processes. For every one time they pass a bill of something, of some substance or consequence, there's 50 other bills waiting on the side for some normal legislative process that just aren't getting attended to or aren't moving through. And so they're not doing anything with their time. And I think that that's the important thing. It's a make work job by the definition, but most of them aren't making work. You'll have some who definitely take it seriously, who definitely are professionals at it, but not all of them.
I liked your slip up of saying they put it on the landslide, which like is like bills that just nothing ever happens to, and they just slide right down the mountain and into
the trash.
to study, which means death.
it is such a fascinating thing to, especially to contrast with how things happen in Congress, which like Congress doesn't need to be praised as a model of anything. However, like when Congress takes up a large bill, and like sometimes this process will be evaded, but when they take up a bill in standard order, you have a committee markup process. That means that committee actually meets in a room, and then there are amendments offered. Those amendments get voted on. There, like some committees share those votes, some don't. Like I think it should be better. And I can't remember if there's like a standard process for that. But like there are votes that they take about what should happen, about what to do to the bill. They actually have, it's like less of a thing in the fact that we have a Democratic supermajority than it was in Congress. That's like typically hotly divided on a partisan basis. But you have minority reports where the minority party can typically prepare something up that this is why about why they object to a bill that's being passed by the majority if it's something on a partisan basis. You also have, in a way that exists again because of the partisan contrast at the national level, you have whips for both the title of whip, the person who's in charge of getting people in line for votes, actually have websites that detail this is what this bill does, this is what these amendments do that we'll be voting on. And which there is nothing so organized that exists in a public foundation to say what people are voting on outside of like after the fact press releases from the Senate president's office.
So I want to talk about a little bit before we actually talk about the amendments and what happens to the amendments about where are we in the legislative cycle right now? We said it's the day before the end of the session. Yeah. And so what happens there's like the budget, right? And the budget is gigantic. And these are amendments to the budget because the budget is one of those few things that actually has to get passed at some point. Right. All these other bills, like they can not end up being passed. And I love Jonathan. I'm so excited a little bit later to talk a little bit about how productive our legislature has been this cycle. But the budget is one of the only things that actually passes every 2 years. And so these are amendments to the budget. And what does it look like over the last few weeks? Like, what does that timeline appear to be? When do these amendments get proposed? Like, what is the shape of this amendments process?
Yeah, so the way that, and Jordan can put a tag in on this. So typically when a bill comes out of committee, whether we're talking about the budget, when that happens in the respective chambers, because the budget process is always kind of in April for the House and the Senate for the Senate in May, or when a bill gets out of the Ways and Means Committee, the executive chamber, and like scheduled for coming up, legislators typically get like 2 days, and sometimes they might get more. But it's often just about 2 days. Sometimes it's less. And then
it's like an 800-page bill. They have to read it,
exactly.
Come up with amendments, like figure out what to change.
Exactly. So like they need to both figure out what's in it, or actually figure out what's in it and what's not, based on what they've been told, and then file amendments to seek to change it. And because of that very compressed timeline that exists, that you just simply, from like an advocacy perspective, it's very difficult to create meaningful change when you have that compressed of a window that you're operating in. That if something does not already command a majority support as well as the support of those in charge, 2 days are not likely to change that. Just because of how compressed that window is. That like if you're sending out an action alert to your supporters via email, somebody might be on vacation and only learn about this even happening after everything is already over. So it requires like very kind of quick turnaround of a process and like a kind of a mad scramble that ends up largely leading to most things not even getting.
Jonathan, as someone who runs, is deeply involved in Progressive Mass, which literally is an organization with grassroots groups on the ground and that mobilizes people to organize in favor of or against bills at the state level. Like, talk about the ability for an organization that is trying to mobilize people when you have 48 hours And it's an
Exactly.
800-page bill. Like, how long does it even take you just to understand and like figure out, and then to mobilize people? Is that even possible?
Exactly. That's the thing. Because like when the bill drops, you need to one, like even figure out how to get access to the text if they
Oh
don't
my God.
late.
Talk about
And
that.
then you need to figure out which organizations are actually analyzing it to see what's in it. And then people see who's even filing relevant amendments, the groups are getting behind. And then it becomes a question of, let's say, is there an actual hope for this amendment to get in? If you know that, like, in the way in which the process is, if people are already opposed to something, 2 days of advocacy will not change that. I would love for it to be otherwise. It's your best bet is for something that was, let's say, like overlooked in the process, or something where there are weakly held positions around, or something that had been bubbling in momentum and that might finally tip over. But for so much of it, it ends up being a flurry of activity, only for a bill to remain largely the same.
So let me ask this question. For specifically talking about this last second amendments to the budget, which is like the biggest flurry.
Yeah.
If we'll move to like this moment in time where it's the budget and there's all these amendments. One of the things that, because we did cover amendments a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
and one of the things that surprised me was the idea that a lot of the amendments that come up in the budget are bills that were sent to study or didn't end up going anywhere, and that bill will just end up as an amendment to the budget. Is this a thing that happens?
So a lot of the budget amendments are end up being a mix of earmarks for the people's districts, or that somebody takes their bill that hasn't passed yet and they file it as a budget amendment, but they don't actually like expect the bill to pass via the budget. They're not interested in spotting their colleagues by making people vote on it.
Spotting, let's remind people what you mean by spotting. Like
by spotting the colleagues by actually, let's say, forcing a roll call on something to make other people take a vote on it to show whether or not they support it. Like they're not really interested in doing that. They don't think that the bill is going to pass through the budget. They just do it. And I've never fully understood the rationale behind that. What I've often said is that, like, if you believe that if you're doing a series of asks for other legislators where you want to see who is willing to do a thing for you, and in the way that you can see on different campaigns, and that you do a series of escalatory asks, and you include it in that perspective, I can understand that. But so many of these, they're not that good of strategists, not doing.
So I can actually talk about the history of how this happened. So this comes from this comes from the broken aspects of the Massachusetts progressive community. So in the past, you've been and in the past, I mean in the distant past, there were abilities to get things that couldn't they couldn't get to the floor through the regular process, but you can get an amendment on the floor to a budget in a way that, like, you don't have to go through committee. So the speaker would hold a bill in committee, and the advocates would get it amended to the budget, and then they couldn't keep it bottled in the committee by a committee chair. And so they did get, and then they would call for a vote. And then all of a sudden, these people who wanted to vote for it because they didn't want to not look like they weren't voting for it would go vote for it, and it would get added as an amendment to the budget. And so that used to happen. That used to be a thing that happened, is advocates would ask people to add it as an amendment to the budget. The legislator would call for a vote for it, and then legislators would vote for it because they saw, I can't not vote for it. Like, this is popular. And
that's the outing that we're talking about, spotting.
That's the outing,
forcing them to vote one way or another.
And so that's what they call spotting, right? Or scarring, as Russell Holmes recently called it. And so because, as Jonathan has rightly said, not here recently, but many times online, that it's a incumbent protection racket. What happened is the leadership basically said, we will protect you at all costs if you also protect each other and never allow actual policy to be debated or voted on in the public. That if you all keep rank, we'll all do our best to keep you together. That only works if the thing you care most about is keeping the most conservative Democrats in power, and it
Your
makes
own
no
job.
sense.
If your biggest thing is your own job,
But
then
not your own job, because this is the thing. It actually not what it does is it puts the progressive legislators at risk and protects the more conservative legislators, because it doesn't even protect them. Jeffrey Sanchez is out of a job. Jeffrey Sanchez would be in a job if he forced votes on things he claimed he believed in. So that's the best thing about it is progressives are so stupid that the progressive legislators are protecting their conservative people, and they're the ones taking the hit for that decision. That's the upside down of this whole thing is that the protection racket has done a thing where the people paying the cost are the most progressive legislators, or the ones who profess to be progressive. In reality, they're not, because they're not willing to actually do things for these ethereal beliefs in something that might be progressive, but I won't do anything to make them happen. So they're the ones that hold that like reap the cost, and the conservative members don't pay the cost. They don't face challenges. Right, people in Norwood and all these conservative on the South Coast, they're not getting challenged on a regular basis from other Democrats, right? So you're protecting them at your own peril, and that's what's so stupid about this whole thing.
Well, let's be really clear, though. I think we haven't put the nail on the head, which is to say, it used to be that they would propose these amendments and make people vote on it. But that is not what they do now. And what we really wanted to talk about today was how people will propose an amendment and then they'll pull the amendment. And pulling the amendment means you don't allow anyone to vote for it. You just say, oh, no, we're not. Here's my amendment, but I'm not going to have anybody vote for it.
And the thing that is I feel like, as an example of this recently, when the House took up their climate bill recently, there were 107 amendments filed. 91 were withdrawn.
Wow.
And it's just kind of a wild thing when you realize that they had staff draft these amendments. Some of them you're just pulling a bill text and plopping it in, but others you're changing a line or something. So you had to do actual work of writing this amendment.
Yeah.
There are the advocates had to do actual work to try to do some degree of advocacy around this. And all you did is you just withdrew it. I mean, at the slightest bit of pressure. And even more absurd than the way that they just all get withdrawn en masse is the fact when some of these times the legislator who's holding the amendment will go up, they'll deliver an impassioned floor speech about the importance of their amendment, and then they will ask for unanimous consent to withdraw it, and it will be withdrawn. And I've never understood what they think that they're accomplishing by doing that, because you don't need to speak those words to your colleagues. If you haven't said those words to your colleagues, what were you doing for your own bill or amendment? They're the ones you needed to be lobbying. If you're speaking to the people at home, guess who watches the legislature's live feed all the time? No one. Unless they're paid to do so. It's not like you have all of these TikTok teens with memeing clips of Massachusetts legislators' floor speeches.
If only.
Yeah. It's bonkers town. And I think so I just want to say it's just so perverse. So I want to highlight what Jonathan is saying. There used to be this tactic which would work, which was to force through the amendment process your colleagues to vote on things they didn't want to vote on. Sometimes they voted and passed terrible. Sometimes that ended up where there would be really bad things in the budget, and sometimes it would be really good things. But they used to do this thing that they did it, and now they no longer do it. But they go through the motions of doing it for only the sake of pretending to care to work on an issue. That's the thing. It's all pretend. It's just to pretend to be doing things on the issues. And these are not small things. These are things that we literally need to make things more affordable, to have healthcare that's better, to have education that works, these are real, to have transportation that allows people to transport around, right? Things that we need. They just go through the pretendness of it. It's make-believe and it's my child, right? They're playing at being legislators while not doing the actual work of forcing, pushing, and cajoling that it takes to get these things. And that's why you have a legislature that that good I like to joke with my colleagues that, like, congratulations, you had 1990s ideas finally pass. Like, this is like, like, takes 8 years, 10 years, 12 years for good ideas to pass the legislature, and then it's one of the 14 good or 12 good, right, ideas that have been around for 14 years. And so, this is the problem with this process, is we are the people who pay the cost. And I think that's why it gets me so mad, is because it's not in reality a good thing to do, because it doesn't affect this. But in their minds, like, why did they do it? They do it because they want to tell us that they're fighting for us without actually fighting for us. That's a really perverse and sick thing to do, because these are real policies that need to pass, that have real things that we need them to do. And going through the motions of pretending is awful. And I want to say also, not just for the legislature, it's really frustrating that the people you give money to, the people you volunteer with, the people who will email you at the last second and say, hey, call your legislator to say, tell them to support this amendment for the budget. They know that it's not going to get voted on. And were it to actually come up for a vote, they themselves are going to tell the legislator, pull it from the floor. We don't want to piss off the speaker. Well, then don't ask for my time. Don't ask for me to sign it. If you're not gonna fight for this for me, if I'm gonna pay you money, give you things, send you to the legislature to fight for this thing, and your thing is to, like, pretend to work on it so you can send me a letter saying, like, hey, we got it to the floor, and, like, look at us, like, look at the thing, but not actually in any way forward this issue on my behalf, then, like, that's how broken this system is that our own advocates, our own progressive community is a part of this absolutely atrocious thing that happens. The only upside is how ineffective and stupid it is. It would be worse if it actually convinced people that it was working on things, right? Like, it would be worse if it got covered in the media as, look, they actually think, right? Like, the only upside is how ineffectual its actual a goal, ineffectual it is at meeting its own goals.
Well, I would love to talk a little bit more about the ineffectual nature, right? I think it would be nice for us, before we do that, just to if we can just throw around, like, what are some, there's been so many amendments proposed and then pulled. Jonathan, you were talking about the climate legislation. There were amendments, proposed. One person, at least one, would propose like 4 amendments, pull them all, and then there are housing amendments that are getting proposed and pulled. There are, and you already said, like, how many amendments there are that are being, can you remind us of that number? It was,
they're like 91 out of 100.
There you go.
This just all reminds me of, this is like years ago that I ended up, like, making this one knock knock joke to mock the state house of, like, knock knock, who's there, house leadership, I've withdrawn all of my amendments. Because, like, that's how I operate.
It's good. But in terms of the ability of the legislature to actually pass things, Jonathan, you did some amazing research to look into this session compared to previous sessions, and just I really want our listeners to hear this, because it's kind of.
So I was curious to see this in terms of, and, like, the numbers will obviously change with, like, whatever happens in the rest of this session.
There's still 24 hours, right? There's still a day, a whole day.
Exactly. And obviously all of these numbers get bloated with home rule petitions and other things that they legally have to pass. But I looked out of curiosity, going back a decade and a half, to see how many bills did get signed into law in the different, like, kind of 2-year periods. So if you go back to 2007 and 2008, 860 things were signed into law. 2009 and 2010, 680. So a little bit of drop there, not quite sure then, but it kind of stays around here. So that then 2012, you get 690, 2013, 2014, 701, 2015, 2016, 635, 2017 and 18, 626. So all of them, they're kind of like the same, like, with enough of a range that, like, it's basically this same thing. Starts dropping a little bit to 2019 and 2020 to 539, 2021, 2022, 564. Again, they're basically the same number in the scheme of things. But then where we are now, we have 227. And so if they want to even catch up to the mid 500s of the last two, they better get on like sending things out fast. Because if not, that's a stunning drop over the course of time of how many things, both a combination of fundamental, like of just like destructive inertia in inaction, as well as like that combined with their tendency to just bundle everything that they might possibly do into the same few bills so they can just negotiate them all together. But even those there aren't that many of those either.
It's wild. It's
Yeah.
wild. I have to. Jonathan hit us with this stat beforehand, and I've been feeling that way, but to get it in such stark numbers, and I think the other thing to remember is that those other years where they were like starting to decline, those are also like, this isn't just this legislature, right? Like we've been going in this direction for some time. They've been slowly but steadily eroding the job of state legislators, of the committees, of staff, right? It hasn't always been like this, but it's like moving in that direction. So even those other times were bad years.
And you can also see that like during COVID, there was a drop. And look, I understand everything was on Zoom. That makes a little bit of sense.
They're trying to get their feet underneath them.
But like if we go down now, like that, we should be going back up now, not down.
Yeah,
exactly. Like I understand why the 2019-2020 session, like you were literally not there for some of that time.
Much harder
and people were trying to figure out how to
debate.
And people were trying to figure out how to do the job virtually.
But then like the fact that like, we could end up just half of that is wild.
It is crazy.
It is. And again, I think a lot of this gets put into just like complaining from like like leftists and all these things, but I again want to focus on like, what is this meaning for you and I and regular people? What does this mean? It means that like right now, right, my daughter does not know where most places in the country are. She has no sense of geography. She has no sense of civics. She does not understand how our government works. And the reason is because all of the time in her classroom is put up on the MCAS. Everyone knows that this is a problem. Everyone. There is not a single person who can look you in the face and say, this makes sense. And yet the legislature is literally not even trying to move anything on this issue. We cannot afford to live here. People are leaving this state because they cannot afford to live here. Young people are piecing out. The normal things that happen, which is like you meet someone, you get married, you want to move in next to your parents. You cannot do that. Yeah. You're just now maybe living in their basement and hoping they're dying. Like that reality, we could fix that. There are actual policies we could be putting in place to give people tools to fix this problem. They are not doing that. They are finally passing the bare minimum, maybe. I mean, I don't know if they'll get it over the line, for prescription drugs. And they're not even attacking the major cause of it, the major driver, which at least the Senate passed. The House won't even consider because of how bought and paid for they are by corporations. They're not addressing any of the underlying symptoms for the broken healthcare system at all in the state. We have the least amount of care and the most amount of cost, but everyone's covered. They're not addressing the fact that we can't get around easily, right? Like I'm planning to go back to school. I can't get from my house to the school in a reasonable amount of time on public transportation. That is bonkers, right? You can't, like, that is like, these are the things, like, it's not just, it's really frustrating because they will say, look, we passed this thing. We helped these people. We did these little things. We got 20,000, 30,000 people at a time. And there's 8 million people here, right? 7 million people. These things are it is the Titanic sinking. We are not addressing these things that are happening in your life on a day-to-day. And there are lots of bills out there that they could be pushing in a supermajority. And I think that's the frustration when you see these numbers decline. Don't just think of them as numbers. Think of them as opportunities to make your life better. And they're doing half as much as they were already doing, which was too little already.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the thing that I like to, like, I have friends and family from out of state. And the thing that I like to point out to them, because they're always like, well, but Massachusetts is better than like your average state, you know? And I'm like, yeah, but Massachusetts, the residents who live in Massachusetts are wildly on the left, like compared to a
Yeah.
red or purple state. We have different values and different desires and different opinions on things. And so the legislature is just not in step. It is a decade, 2 decades behind what the constituents in Massachusetts want. That to me is why, you know, we talk about all these, you know, progressive policies and like, sure, this is our opinion, but the legislature is very much out of step with the constituents. And they can be because of our unbelievably broken system at the state house, where the speaker and their leadership team control the entire process. And they are able to determine which bills can pass and which bills won't. And we basically, like, we have a legislature that does almost nothing compared to other states. We pass very few bills. We are now passing even fewer. And I'm going to make a little pitch. First of all, please donate to the show, because you don't hear this kind of stuff often. We need far more progressive voices in the media. And your donations really allow us to make sure that the messages, the quotes from here, the social media and all that stuff can get out to as many people as possible. But I'm also going to pitch next episode, which I really want you guys to tune into, because since tomorrow is the end of the session, we are going to be talking about this session and everything that happened. We will be giving you guys a lot of information that you're not going to hear anywhere else. So please do tune in next time. And on that note, unless there are closing comments from either of you, what a pleasure always to talk about, you know, the legislative cycle, to talk about amendments, to talk about the crazy way that we do things here in Massachusetts and how broken it is. And we thank you all for listening. Thank you for forwarding the show to your friends. And we look forward to chatting with everyone again next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.